Welcome to this episode of The Meaning Mindset with Rabbi Ron. It's a pleasure to be with you and to bring another conversation that I hope will have insight and meaning for you as it does for me. My guest is Pastor Dave Roberts. I found out about Pastor Dave through the radio. He has a program in Los Angeles, KABC radio on Sunday mornings. I'm not up when, or I'm not available on Sunday mornings when he's broadcasting, so I'll listen to it on the website at another time. And I found that he's a fascinating man, a warm, insightful man, a wise man, a great teacher and thinker. And it's a gift to not only hold his book in my hands, which is Healing Conversations, and that's the name of his broadcast and podcast as well, Healing Conversations, talking yourself out of conflict and loneliness, with the senior pastor of Montrose Church here in California, Pastor Dave Roberts. Let's join him for this episode of The Meaning Mindset with Rabbi Ron. So you and I have never met until now.
Just now.
Yeah, really a pleasure. I feel like I know you because I've heard you on your podcast. And my dad's the one who introduced me to you. He said, you've got to hear this pastor on the radio that I listen to Sunday mornings. And lately what I've been doing is listening to other podcasts, just out of curiosity. What do they sound like? Mm-hmm. Produced, less produced, all this. And reading books that are the book written by the next guest. So this was one of those. I said, Dad, I promise I will listen to him. I just need to get the headspace for it.
Right.
And I listened, not on a Sunday morning,
right,
but on a Thursday at the gym, whenever it was.
That 6 a.m. is tough.
Yeah, exactly. One person has to do that.
Right.
But I really enjoyed a couple of things. One is your content and your voice. I think without meeting you only through your thoughts, I take you to be humble and kind, not to quote a song lyric, truly, and generous in your thinking. And that's a pleasure to encounter.
Well, thanks. I appreciate that.
Of course.
The goal certainly is that. I don't know if you always make it, but that's the goal.
Right. Yeah. In the introduction, I mentioned your book, and the book is the name of your podcast,
right?
The radio conversations, Healing Conversations, talking, all in caps, yourself out of conflict and loneliness.
Yeah.
What led to this title, this whole project?
I'm a practitioner, so in that I deal with real people in the real world and real problems every day. I think a lot of ministry in general is pain management and conflict management, because that's who comes to find you. I mean, people who are hurting are your kind of the front line, and you spend a lot of time with those people. And I think, I'm in a lot of settings where it's doctor, and Dave. And so I find myself being in the role of practitioner a lot. And so that book is about just my observations. If you're going to engage in a healing conversation, and let's face it, how else do we know each other? How else do we learn? How else do we grow? How else do we teach? We can be instantaneously in touch with anyone in the world now. I mean, thanks to technology. And yet we talk less, and we are less effective in our talking, from political top to bottom, from interpersonal relationships. And so the book is just, here's 7 elements that I believe have to be included if you're going to have a truly healing conversation. And I think we stumble into them. I mean, sometimes we have a conversation and we come away going, that was so life-giving. That was so wonderful. But so I'm attempting somehow to say, I think this is what's happening in those situations.
That's it. It's kind of roll back the tape and say, okay, what
happened?
What happened? Yeah, I feel like it's worth breaking up the two words for a moment. One is healing, what our understanding of healing is, what your understanding of it is, what's the difference between cure and healing.
Yeah.
And the other is separate, and maybe that's a longer conversation about discourse.
Yeah. About
what we are and aren't doing. Where do you want to start?
Well, let's start maybe with the conversation side. Okay. There's very little genuine conversation. There's debate, which may be the poorest form of communication. I'm convincing you of something. I have an agenda. As soon as we sit down, I know what my goal is. You may not know it, and you probably have a goal with me. So I'm formulating arguments while you're talking. And then there's, discussion. But discussion generally means it's a moderated affair. There's some controls on what's happening here, and you may not be in control. Somebody else might be in control. And then there's a genuine kind of dialogue that is free and open. We're actually learning. Henry Nouwen talks about the movement from hostility to hospitality, where we set aside and we're no longer thinking about our agenda, our stuff. We're thinking about, how do I create empty space so I can understand you, so I'm learning who you are. And I think it's a lost art. I find myself, in a lot of conversations, and I'll go to lunch with someone and come back and somebody will say, how was it? And I say, it was great. It was great. And they'll say, well, why was it great? Because they asked me a lot of questions about me, and they let me talk about me, and there was room for me to be me. And because I think when you go, why did I enjoy it?
Yeah.
Because somebody created genuine hospitality. And I think that's the idea of a conversation is, let's stop battling each other. Every human being is an immense resource of life and information, and we very rarely ever get there. We very rarely get there.
You said something that I loved, among many things that I loved and agree with, that we need to create a space for that to happen. It's almost like we have a vessel, and I'm going to show up to the conversation with my vessel full. I know what I want to offload, pour into your head and heart.
Sure.
And what if I say, let me just empty it out on the way in, or even now in this moment, and create a space for it to be filled as it'll naturally be filled when two human beings actually find each other and engage.
Right. Yeah. And I think in that is some sense of, the therapeutic reality of understanding each other. So I say this to couples in therapy all the time, I'm not sure you're conflicting, but I'm sure you don't understand. And so how many conflicts are resolved simply because we slowed down, we emptied the vessel, we learned, and we found out, we're not really in conflict. We actually agree. And even if we don't agree, now we have a pretty clear way forward. Whereas all that emotional stuff, there is no therapeutic way of moving forward until we slow down and then understand. And I throw these statistics around because I make them up. But, I think 90% of conflict is just not understanding the conversation.
I think it's 92%.
Is it 92? Yeah. Perfect. There's a study that says,
Yeah, double blind, you and I.
You and I. That's exactly right.
There's a book that I read that has really had an impact on me. I heard the speaker. It was a leadership conference, and in the book, author I'm forgetting, but the book is Crucial Conversations.
Okay.
And what he says is, and I'm going to misquote a very good author and book, but basically here's my takeaway in this moment. He said there are certain moments in conversation when the stakes are high. There's an emotional component to the conversation. People have strong feelings about it.
Yeah.
First of all, I don't know that he says this, but I say don't text that.
Yeah.
Get off email.
So good.
Right? I learned that from a good colleague. If there's an emotional component from the delivery end or the recipient's end, it doesn't belong on text or email.
Yeah.
So one thing that he says is when we know we have those stakes that are high, start with a conversation about what you share, what you want together. I mean, you and I, by the way, could start with it so easily. Having known you for about 7 minutes, plus read you, and I should say, listen to you, I know that we share certain values, different beliefs, certain values that are common to us. And that tells me if I wanted to have a crucial conversation with you about a problem, let's say, I would start with what we share.
Yeah.
What you and I know matters most in this world. And it could be the well-being of our kids in the religious school.
Yeah.
right? If you're the director or I'm the director, who knows what. The second piece is talking about the positives that we see in the relationship and in the other person, but it has to be done with sincerity.
Sure.
Otherwise, this falls apart, step 1 or 2. And finally, we then earn the right to talk about the issue that we want to discuss.
Right.
And if we go to 3 before 2 and 1, basically what you're doing is you're imagining that everybody in those moments has their fists up in defense.
Yeah.
Because we tend to, as soon as you sit down in the principal's office, the boss's office.
Right.
So how do we, in a way that is really compassionate and truthful, get them to see that they're safe and seen and understood? And then you can solve a problem together on the basis of that.
Yeah, I love that. And going back to where you started, we have a mantra around our church, and that is the more emotional the conflict, the more intimate the conversation, which goes exactly against our tendency. If I'm in conflict with somebody, if something's going on that's emotional, I want to shoot them a quick text because I don't want to talk to them. Right. I want to do what I have to do. And I find in ministry, if you're not willing to step into that space and say, Hippocrates said, it's more important for a person to understand the person who has the disease than the kind of disease the person has. Mm-hmm. And I think, we do that well in the medical world, but we don't do it in the interpersonal world very well. I don't always need to be working on the problem. I need to be working on the person and the relationship, and then the problem starts to untie itself I can't tell you how many times caring for the person now makes the conversation make sense. It's like, okay, we can disagree, but I care about you. I say to some of the people that speak in our environment, the more people you get to know and the more intimately you get to know them, the better speaker you'll become. Mm-hmm. Not because you got any technically better, but because people now know you and cheer for you instead of criticizing you.
Yeah, I agree with you. It's about it's openness and curiosity at its core, right? I think it's Joseph Grenny who wrote the book, Crucial Conversations. Where do we get stuck? Because we all get stuck in this. Yeah. It's not like you and I, because we're sitting on a podcast saying this is the way to do it, or doing it with any consistency. No, just ask our wives, right? Yeah,
exactly. And that's always the test, isn't it? I mean, whatever your theory is, let's bring it down to reality.
Right. Let me text your wife and check. So how do we develop the self-awareness that isn't paralyzing, that says just notice yourself more?
Yeah. Well, I think, we're thinking a lot more these days in the moral psychology movement or the positive psychology movement about being, metacognitive thinking, thinking about your thinking.
Yeah.
You're not a victim of your thoughts. You get to choose. You get to decide how your brain is going to, focus and function, and with some intentionality, some practices. We can train our brains to think better thoughts. And so I think, there is some sense in which, you mentioned this just a minute ago, but that when you start a conversation, you're talking about goals, because I think we're highly procedure-oriented in our culture, in our world, in our politics. I'm just listening now to all of the debates and everything running up to this election cycle, and how often it's about what might happen if, instead of what is happening and what we would rather have happening. We spend enormous amounts of time trying to circumvent a potential thing that's out there to the point that we're not really living in the present. And I think that happens interpersonally. I'm worried about how you're going to see this. I'm worried about what you're going to say. I'm worried about where this conversation is going to go. I'm anticipating what might happen. I'm going to start editing and shaping before we ever talk. And if I can't sit down at the beginning and go, hey, my goal is that when we're done here, we're closer, and we've connected better. I value you. I think it's important. You matter to me. Your feelings matter to me. Your story matters to me. That's the goal. Now, we've got to talk about some things, but we got to start with the end in mind. We've got to start with some sense that we're goal-oriented, not procedure-oriented. Because I do believe this, and I think I talk to a wide variety of people. Most people want good things.
Right.
I rarely meet people that I'm like, that's a scary human. I just don't meet them. Sometimes, but it's very rare. But we don't all agree on how to get them. And so if we have similar goals, why do we have so much fear and divisiveness and anger in our culture? And I think it's because we've just become, it's all about how this bottom piece works, but it isn't. It's about where we're going and then what's the most efficient, healthy way to get there, I think.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think we're all puzzled by the world right now and saying we can diagnose it. We can see the problems. Mm-hmm. It's ill. There's an illness in the society. It's showing up in ways of anger. I mean, did you see the statistics on road rage? Oh,
no, I haven't.
Outrageous.
Yeah,
unbelievable.
I'm sure.
And I think California might be the worst in the country.
Maybe.
Laid back, sunny, warm, but still people just amped up. That tells you something. Yeah. That's a little indicator. Yeah. It's like something coming to the surface on the body that says there's disease within. The other thing is we're not able to have curious conversation because either I don't want to hear your point of view, I'm just not interested based on what I think it is, my understanding of it, or I'm threatened by it and I don't want to give you voice because I don't want that point of view to come into the room.
Yeah. And you've used this word a few times, curiosity. It's one of the elements. And I think I love this. Kimberly Clark did a big ad campaign in the late 90s. And they just basically put a couch in the middle of urban settings, New York City, on a sidewalk, put a couple of chairs and a box of Kleenex on a stand, and invited people to sit down. And the moderator just asked them questions. What are you doing? What's going on in your life? And in minutes, and obviously, the magic of television and its ad work, but people shared. Yeah. And it was only a matter of minutes before they were crying. And some were crying tears of joy, and some were crying tears of grief, and some were just in awe at someone asking them questions and being curious about them at any level. And I think that's what a therapist does. A therapist is really good at being curious about a person. And they're not just curious because they're getting paid, not good ones. Right. Good ones are curious because they can genuinely step into your story and ask you meaningful questions. And I think curiosity is huge. But as we disrespect others, I think we are less curious about their story. And I also think we do feel lost. I think people feel lost and invalidated. And therefore, in so many relationships, we're looking for positivity. We're looking for affirmation. We're needing someone to say, way to go. And then everybody's waiting on that, and it never happens. And so real curiosity is about how can I be present for someone else? Am I curious? You can't fake it. You can't pretend. I was in a seminary class years ago, and some kid raised his hand and said, what kind of ministry do you recommend for people that don't like people? And you're kind of, maybe none. Maybe that's not a good, because if you don't really like people and you don't really want to know about them, it's going to be tough. It's going to be tough.
Yeah.
But I think that's real life. I mean, because I find people are like, why is this going bad? Well, you don't like people. It's how can your interpersonal world be very good when your opinion of others is so low?
Yeah. We all meet people who say, I don't like people. Yeah. And it brings a smile because I think part of it says, nah, I think I get what you're saying. I think the trouble is some people may like people, certain people who agree with them, who look like them, who behave the way they do, but they're just not interested in dissonance.
Yeah,
I don't like dissonance that much in music. I really like it around me. Mm-hmm. I'm stimulated by it. I think that's what provokes constant curiosity.
Absolutely. Well, and I think, there's an old story about some previous CEO of General Motors, and his habit was if a motion passed without opposition, they tabled it. Mm. Because he would say, if there's no opposition, we're missing something. Yeah. This can't be that good of an idea. There's no way that there's not things we ought to be thinking about. And I think we've lost that perspective. There's a biblical idea that says God created human beings very diversely, and then he threw them together and it's their synergy together that makes life work. It's not their, it's not the fact that they're alike. It's not, we're not creating homogeneous things. We're creating harmony.
Yeah.
And I think we've lost that. I think we've lost that mentality. I need people who are different from me. I am missing so much if I don't. There's a great story that a pastor wrote about the fact that he lives in Boston. If you live in Boston and you're clergy, you get free tickets to the Red Sox games. And the way it works is you just get a general admission ticket. You can sit anywhere, there's an empty seat. And so he tells a story of going, and of course he goes down behind home plate, and then he can hear and see and smell the grass. He can hear the conversations, and then somebody shows up and it's their seat and he has to move. And so he moves up, and now he can kind of see the whole infield, and he can see how players are moving, and then somebody shows up, and eventually he ends up in the top deck, and he can see the whole field, and he can see, the bullpen, and he can see, and he says, here's the thing, in life I get one seat.
Yeah.
And I'm missing so much. And if I don't live in some way vicariously through the experience of others, I'm going to miss, and I'm going to not understand what I need to see and understand. And I'm not going to be very good in my interpersonal relationships.
Yeah, it's a great story.
Yeah, it's a great story.
Yeah, it is. It's a great visual. I feel like somebody right now is making a little video depiction of it. We do get fixed in a place. On the other hand, I think we have more flexibility and ability to change our perspective than we own and give ourselves credit for. Maybe it's because we live here in La La Land.
Maybe.
That we think, I've got to use this lens that I was given. But we know that a good cameraman has a multitude of lenses and says, I want to zoom in on that one thing, or I want to go out wide and see the entire environment. Maybe that's the story in not as beautiful terms. But I don't want to frame everything we're talking about as the problems of the world, but maybe by talking about them, we can find ways to think about change. Yeah. Change is difficult.
Yeah. I think, again, I'm just a terrible optimist, and, when it's all said and done, I'll look back and go, I guess I was wrong. I think people want good things. I mean, I think that's true across the political spectrum. I've heard of this study, though I've never tracked it down. I'm still in the process of trying to figure it out. But a study that was done that basically said about 80% of people in the country agree on the big issues.
Right.
But 10% on each extreme, left and right, have the voices and have, and I think there's a reason for that. If you're going to raise money in this culture, you almost have to say, if we don't win, our whole way of life is going down the drain.
Absolutely. It's catastrophic thinking.
Yeah. And so I just think that reality of there's a lot of people in the world who could have very meaningful conversations, but we don't because we're afraid. And we've been taught, it's us and them.
Yeah.
If you're not on this side, you got to be on that side. If you're on that side, we don't have anything in common. How could you think that way? And that's being articulated at every level of our culture, from entertainment people to politicians to athletes. They're articulating this idea. Half the country are either, corrupt and immoral and have no compass, or they're ignorant and they don't get it. And that's just not true. But when you start with that premise, when that's what you're fed constantly, and we believe it, we double down.
We do believe it. I don't think you're wrong. I think we think about that other person. Obviously, the obvious one right now is politics.
Yeah.
And we think, what must they believe? Well, I know what they believe because they're one being, one homogenous group, and they believe these things about this issue. Whereas when you talk to people, often on an individual level, look, there's some people who, like the rest of us, don't know enough to have the right to vote.
Right.
And by the way, I think that's true of all of us.
Yeah.
Kind of bothers me how little power we have and how much power.
Yeah.
But to be able to say, I understand the issue of, throw it out there, immigration, abortion, when life begins, what the meaning of life is when it ends, that becomes an issue in politics as well. And foreign policy.
Mm-hmm.
Who has that kind of expertise?
Right.
And yet will quote somebody in a 2-second soundbite, basically, and claim a certain expertise and say, "Oh, we're on the right side of this issue or the wrong side."
Well, have you done any study on confirmation bias? And,
yeah, of course. Not study, but yes.
Yeah.
Right.
Absolutely.
Absolutely.
But that idea
and negativity bias as well about other people.
Yeah. And that your brain is helping you. It knows how much information is coming at you. So it's going to filter, and how efficiently it filters anything contrary to what you think, and how efficiently it grabs hold of everything that confirms what you think. And, I think we try to talk about this out loud in our environment, and that is your social media feed it's for connection, it's for engagement, it is not for information. Don't you be fooled. They are giving you things to keep you on there, not to help you be a well-informed person. If you're going to be well-informed, you're going to have to work at that.
Yeah,
it's not going to come to you. Yeah. Take some energy.
And some longer listening. There's a lot of good information.
Yeah.
YouTube is full of great conversations. Hearing an expert who's going to tell you something about something you don't know will. Mm-hmm. I think that's the university of the internet, which is fantastic.
Yeah.
But I don't know necessarily that any of us have the right to our pounded fist. Mm-hmm. I am right. On anything, by the way.
Yeah. Well, so in the book, one of the elements is humility.
Yeah.
And I define humility as this way. I don't know very much. I believe some things, and I can believe passionately. But if I start out by saying to you, I know and you don't, we're not going to have a conversation. We can't get past this one point, because I think I know. And if I know, I'm not going to be open. The whole tone of my conversation, my body language, the way I'm thinking is going to already exclude the possibility of any of the other elements of, respect or curiosity or self-disclosure or any of the other things can't really happen if I think I know and you don't. And I don't think anybody knows. I don't listen to talking heads on TV and go, well, they really know what they're talking about. They believe some things.
Yeah. And
that's okay. We ought to believe, and we ought to have some passion, but we ought to be distinct in saying, I think this is my experience. This is what happened to me. And by the way, there was a study that says, what's the single most influencing characteristic on why people are what they are, why they're, a Democrat or Republican, why they're this, why they're religious, why they're not. What's the single most influencing factor? And the study found it was experience. It's what happened to you. It wasn't your parents. It wasn't how you were taught. It wasn't where you were brought up. It was what happened to you. Mm. And I think when you understand that, you go, okay, something happened to you.
How do you understand that? Because I just a couple days ago was talking to somebody, and I said, I think we're in many ways hearing our parents' voices in our heads when we come to values and beliefs. So you're saying it's a factor, but it's not the greatest factor.
Well, if your parents influenced you and then you had a positive experience, then you value that. And so, okay. But your experiences of what your parents taught you is what validated what was happening. That's how I interpret it. And if your parents taught you something and your experience said they were wrong, mm-hmm. then you throw that away. You're like, that's not but what your parents told you was either affirmed by your experiences or it was denied by your experiences. I think that's how it works. That is how it works in my experience. Yeah. I find myself a lot of times having a conversation with a younger person who's been raised in, religion, in the church, and having to say, well, there's a lot of ways you could, this is what happened to you. What is that? Let's have a bigger conversation. It doesn't have to mean if your experiences don't fit what you were taught that you just have to quit everything.
Right.
But maybe we need to reshape that. Maybe it wasn't quite accurate. There's a way inside of here to be very authentic and real, which I think is, maybe rare in religion.
Maybe
it's easy to not be real.
Right.
I like to think about part of my job as a pastor is to break the fourth wall. In television we have three walls,
absolutely. And
you're not supposed to break the fourth wall. We keep the illusion alive. I think that's the last thing we need to do in faith. Okay. We need to break the fourth wall and say, this is what it says and this is what we've always taught, but is that happening to you? Does that work in real life?
Yeah.
I think we got to keep coming back to the reality, because if not, there's all kinds of studies of people moving away from faith in all of its forms. I think part of it is because we've promised things that aren't true. We've said things that can't be lived out in real life. And that's a quick way to go, I'm not doing that anymore.
Right.
So
it brings a couple things to mind. One is, what do we do? What does good ministry in any religion, in the basic sense of the term, look like to you? I'm a big believer, by the way, in breaking down the fourth wall. I know you've heard that somewhere. I think just heard that 1 in 6 pastors and rabbis.
Yeah.
I never wanted in my synagogue to be up on a pedestal, right, where the clergy are inaccessible.
Absolutely.
I grew up there, and I think we've all had an experience of that, where whoever it was that was leading, there was just such a divide between them and us that they were untouchable.
Mm-hmm.
What does that serve?
Yeah, absolutely.
I'd rather people know. And by the way, that leads me to share some of my vulnerabilities as appropriate with my community, but
absolutely,
as a regular feature of my relationship to them, because I'm not trying to project anything other than authenticity.
Yeah.
I don't know that they're getting that in all walks of religious life, and that's maybe not my place to judge, but I'm just saying sounds like that's you. Sounds like that's something that we have in common.
Yeah, I mean, my opinion is what we do as far as to me, everything happens at a local level. I mean, you can be philosophically, denominationally, whatever all that is. But what happens week to week inside our community is really what matters. It's what is happening. It's the real world. And I think, we're not there to instruct people. We're not there to teach them, a better way of living. We are there to journey together. That's what this is. We're in it together. We're figuring it out. I try to say to anyone on our staff that's going to teach, they could care less about what you know. The chances are, if you know it, they know it. Mm-hmm. What they want to know is, what are you learning? What are you struggling with? That's the conversation. Because, and I think that authenticity and what's appropriate, I mean, obviously there's, limits to what that, but, you never want to be the person with a microphone that's talking about, that you're the hero of the story. That nobody wants to hear that. I mean, and it's not true. Right. Like you mentioned a minute ago, ask your wife. You may sound really good because you got the microphone and nobody can question you. But the truth is, you're the person that says, hey, this is hard for me. I mean, I read it, and this is really hard for me. And I think that kind of vulnerability opens the door to more meaningful connection,
Yeah. 1 in 6, you see, this is a statistic that you can now refute. I read recently, wrote it down, 1 in 6 families have parents with children who don't talk to them.
Wow.
Because of politics. We don't need to go back to politics, but we can talk about that 1 in 6 people in line at Starbucks isn't talking to their kid or parent over dissonance, the things they don't share in common in terms of that one aspect of life.
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, I'm a little shocked that it's that low. I mean, I would almost like 3 in 6. I don't know. I think there's, because here's what, and maybe for the other 5 out of 6, they just have decided we will sit, but we won't talk about anything that's conflicted.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
We're not getting into meaningful conversation. And I think what's hard is, it is hard to get good information. So for example, I think about this all the time. An electric car. Can someone just produce an unbiased study that says yes or no?
Right.
It's worth it. It works. Because on one side you read and go, an electric car will have to function for 15 years to recover from the carbon footprint of being created. And on the other, and I would just love to see an unbiased study that says, no, here's the real deal. This is actually worth doing.
Yeah.
And why can't, people are smart. Why don't we talk about that kind of stuff instead of, but if it's the other side that's going to, all that kind of stuff. I think we've lost the ability to have meaningful connections. So when we're conflicted in our homes, we just don't go down those roads. We don't talk about that subject anymore.
Yeah, or we show up and shut each other down.
Yeah.
Grandpa stopped talking politics or religion. Those were always paired together.
Yeah.
And maybe we've got past the division on religion. We can talk about that. I don't
Yeah.
know. But what about solutions?
Well, I think for me personally, I think about this. We're supposed to be the lead servants. I think especially in ministry, we're supposed to be the people that are the first to step up and say, "How love God, love your neighbor." It's pretty simple stuff.
Mm-hmm.
I've always say there's one sermon: love God, love your neighbor, and then we repackage it every week. But at some level, in order to love others, that there's this reality of trying to just settle into a space where I can really listen. I can really make myself available. I can genuinely humble myself. And so I think part of the solution is in all areas of life, we need less activists and more servants.
Hmm.
We need folks, because I think in almost every context, let's take back to politics. Isn't politics really about service?
I think so.
Yeah, but where is the service? Where did we decide I only want to serve this 50.55 or 58 or
It's
51, whatever the number is? I'm only serving this group, and that group is crazy. When did we get there? When did we decide that? And so then you're like, no, you're elected to serve. You're a servant to all the people. And are you doing that well? And so maybe part of the solution is we just act, how do I serve my family? Because I do have, I've got 4 daughters, 4 adult daughters. My oldest turns 41 today.
Wow.
My youngest is 26, about to be 27. Even within that context, they're not alike. They're very different in their politics. They're very different in their understandings. They're very different in their perspectives. Don't I, as the dad, want to serve all of them? Not become an activist and say, either conform or don't come to dinner.
Right.
And if you're coming to dinner, keep your mouth shut. Who wants that kind of life?
Yeah, it's back to that issue of love, and love is an act of generosity constantly. It brings me back to your baseball story. And part of it is when I'm down here, I just see my needs.
Yeah.
And my beliefs. They're very focused and clear. But as I get higher up, maybe it's kind of like people say in the executive boardroom, you want the 30,000 foot
Right.
expansive understanding of your world. Get up there and look at your company, your organization, your society from that perspective. Or religiously, we might say, what does God see?
Mm-hmm.
And if I look at it from that point of view, none of this makes sense.
Yeah.
It only makes sense down here.
Right.
But if I get higher up and I imagine whatever I understand God to be, that God has, even just use God as a word, a tool
Yeah.
for higher, larger perspective, none of this makes sense.
Yeah.
Get back to the table.
Yeah.
Be in conversation.
Yeah. And to me, it's not that hard. It's not that hard as a leader to say, blah, 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 blah. But I want to talk to those other people now because I know what you're feeling. Because I said this, but you're thinking this, but I don't mean that. And here's why I don't mean that. I don't mean that because I think this about you, and I think this about that way of thinking, and I think that's valid, and I think that's important. For example, here's a hot topic in church, in religion. What about psychotherapy? Because you have people who are like, just pray,
Right.
and God will fix everything, And so to say, there is some element in which prayer and faith has some role in being a fully integrated human being, mind, body, soul, working together. I think, God wants to create that kind of health inside of us. That said, if I'm going to talk about that, I also want to stop and say, but for some of you, you will need someone to help you. And there are wonderfully gifted people in the social sciences, and social science is a science.
Right.
It's not voodoo. It's not magic. I want to talk to those people. If I'm going to say this stuff, I want to talk to those people. And I think it's not that hard to go, who's out there listening that they're going to feel hurt or singled out, and that's not what we mean. That's not what we're saying. And I think we could do that easily in politics. Here's what I think and here's what I value, but I know what you're scared of, and let me address that.
Yeah.
I don't think it's that hard, but that's not how you get money, and that's not how you win elections. You've got to stand yourself out from those people.
Yeah, and fear is galvanizing.
Man, hugely. And the church has thrived on that for a lot of generations, you know.
Right. I mean, I think that it's unfortunately powerful.
Yeah.
It keys into our ultimate vulnerability, which is what if. Yeah. And now if you and I have a multi-generational family, then it's even more of an issue, which is I'm not even thinking my generation. What will be the world that I'm leaving to them and them and them? And if somebody can just tug on that string and make us more fearful, we're going to get smaller and smaller and probably less vulnerable, open, curious, because fear has that capacity.
Yeah. I reflect on this, and I don't have the, studies to back me up, but it seems to me, I do read a lot, and I do read a lot of history, and, there was a season in the history of this country, and I think the world, in which philanthropy was celebrated.
Right.
We celebrated people who were wealthy and gave generously to hospitals and museums and, universities and all the things we value. Today we vilify people with money, and it seems to me, how simple would it be to go back and go, you know what, let's encourage, let's celebrate, let's motivate people forward into something positive instead of chastising them. Because I don't think it works for any of us. I don't think any of us grow and do our best work. I say it like this sometimes. You're on a ship and you're going somewhere, and you can spend your life down in the hold killing rats, because there's a lot of rats to kill. But every once in a while you ought to get up on the deck. Yeah. And you ought to look at where you're going and you ought to see the beauty of it. Because if you spend your whole life killing rats, that's not a great life, And I think that's true in our own interpersonal world. It's true in our politics, but there is this place of going, no, I'm alive.
Right.
And when the doctor says you got a disease and you're not going to live, all you want to do is live. You don't want to kill rats.
Right.
You want to look ahead. You want to be alive. You want to celebrate,
There's a Jewish teaching that I love, a story that says basically man comes to God, says, I did everything right. I prayed in the right way and I studied and studied and studied. And God says, but you didn't see my Alps?
Yeah. Isn't it true? And how, we live in the foothills. So, you head up the 2 freeway and you drive into the mountains. And when we bring guests, from somewhere else, they're like, wow, you live here? This is beautiful. And you're like,
oh, yeah.
Yeah, I guess it is. Yeah. I don't really look at it anymore.
Yeah, of course. What do you think of, cure versus healing? And in some ways, the whole conversation has been about that.
Yeah.
But for people who say, I don't believe in healing because I've seen people suffer and I've seen people die.
Sure.
And I've seen things that can't be cured by medicine or religion. What do you do with that?
Well, there is no cure. There is only healing. I think that reality of, because, you get into the stories of healing and faith healers and all that other stuff. And, there are therapeutic things that help us, but right now the statistics are about 100% on death. I mean, whether you get a healing from this moment, there's not a cure for, mortality. Yeah. I mean, mortality is what it is. But I think that's really important, because I think, where do you go for good news? Where do people, the common person today, where are they going to receive some good news? The sources of good news are very slim, but good news is therapeutic for the soul. It's very important. Some of us get it at home. Some of us have great families, great spouses who build us up and encourage us, and we get good news. So there are places to get it, but it's rare.
Good news isn't entertainment.
No.
I think we think, well, where do I get it from? My phone? No, but maybe the TV. That's not the same as good news.
No, it has to be true. Yeah. Truth has a pragmatic element. So when politicians talk and say, I think we should do this. And you're like, that's a great idea. However, that's just an idea. It's an ideal.
Yeah.
And we all can all applaud that. But I don't think you have any plan of implementation, because I don't know how you would do that. I don't know how that would work. And that's what our public policy is today. We have so many things that look good on the top, but they have no actual pragmatic application. They don't work. They can't be true. Good news must be true. A politician can say, I don't know. And when did we lose this trial and error mentality? I don't know how to fix it, but let's try some stuff. Let's try it.
Yeah, but that doesn't get elected.
Oh, no.
Can you imagine somebody coming in front of the cameras and the mics and saying, I don't know?
Yeah.
Or I need more time on that.
Yeah.
Yeah. We lose faith, ironically, in that, in somebody saying, I am human and I have an ideal, but I'm going to put a team together and we're going to do our best.
Yes. And we have this follow the science, but we don't follow the science. We were like, that didn't work, but if we did it more, that would work. Well, it's somewhere there's a dishonesty in that. And so good news has to be connected into something that's pragmatic. In the New Testament, there's this, Jesus teaches the Sermon on the Mount, the Beatitudes. Sure. And he says, blessed are the meek, for they'll inherit the earth. And the word that he speaks it in Aramaic, but Matthew translates it into Greek. And the word he chooses is praus. Well, the word praus is about 500 years old when Matthew chooses it. It's coined by Aristotle. And Aristotle, of course, is the philosopher who's trying to figure out what is virtue. And he's saying, what does it mean to discover virtue? And he's the guy that says virtue is the middle ground between extremes. So if you want to be, a person with a good disposition, you find the space between being indifferent and being full of rage. That's the middle ground. If you want to be a person of generosity, it's the middle ground between being foolish and being stingy. And so he has a whole life's work of what is virtue. It's the middle ground. And the word he coins to describe the golden mean, the middle ground, is praus. Well, that's the word Matthew chooses. Blessed are those who find the middle ground between the extremes, because that's generally where the truth lies. It lies in the middle. It's not over there and it's not over there. It's in here, because both sides have something to contribute to this thing that's pragmatic and true.
So what happens on the macro level that we see in the society is happening on the micro level in the human being.
Absolutely.
Which is we swing one way or the other, sometimes back and forth as a society. We do the same thing in ourselves.
Yeah.
And I think there's a program called Mussar, Mussar, really interesting, a kind of school of thinking in Judaism that is entirely oriented to that. What is middle ground? Mm-hmm. And I've seen people who have been at one end and not the other, and you see the unhappiness in them and around them.
Yeah.
And I think the country does that too. And countries, we say America because we're so America-oriented, but the whole world is dealing with those issues.
Yeah, way more than ever before. Way more global reality than ever before. But I think there is healing in the middle ground. I think, to get back to that question about cure versus healing, there is something therapeutically whole about truth, and truth is not like, I know the truth. Remember, we don't know, we believe, but truth is much more practical than that. It has to be much more practical than that. It's not your ideal or my ideal. It's not your, a religious background or my religious background. Truth is, this is therapeutically whole. This is real. It makes a difference. My life works better. My relationships work better. I don't need a gimmick. I need an understanding. I need things that, and I think that's our task, is to invoke wisdom. And there's no lack of wisdom. The books, the incredible wisdom that has been put down on paper for us, if we are willing to apply it and hear it and read it,
Do you think your seminary training, let me ask it this way, did it lead you to this thinking and this place, or has that evolved since then? I don't mean there wasn't a kernel of good understanding that came from that.
I do think this. I don't know that I would say this is still, because seminaries go through their own evolutionary changes and priorities. But when I came through, it was the most refreshing because I'd done my undergrad in a religious environment too. That was much more like, here's the answer, and
Where
this is
was
what
that?
That was now it's called Southern Nazarene University
Okay.
in Oklahoma City. But so when I got to seminary, and professor said, "We're just going to teach you because the truth is the truth, and so you're going to be, free thinking here. In fact, year one, we're going to tear down all the folk theology you've been taught in your journey because it's not going to serve you well when you get into the real world. And then we're going to try to equip you with, year two with some tools. And then year three, we hope you begin to synthesize." So I think what they taught me was they taught me to think, and they taught me to dig. And so they didn't really answer all the questions by any means, but they did try to make it clear that my job, my task, is to continue to learn and grow and be curious. And, and I do think then experience in the real world, if you make yourselves available to real people in real pain, your theology will have to evolve. It'll have to change.
Yeah. I don't know. I remember going into the early classes in seminary, which for me was about 6 years of study and driving and study and driving and reading and reading and reading. I was relearning things I knew and getting a new perspective on them, which was challenging. I was hearing other voices. I wasn't used to that. I don't know about you, but I didn't do an undergrad that was in religion, so I wasn't used to a circle of people around a table having other points of view on the same two words, on the same idea, on the same practice. And I kept thinking, and I think what came out of that for me was curiosity.
Yeah.
And definitely a sense of not having punctuation, not knowing where the comma comes and where the period comes, or certainly the exclamation mark. What I mean is having a flexibility of ideas.
Yeah.
And I don't think I'd say that served me.
Yeah.
Now, somebody else might say that made you to this and not that.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
That's okay. I've got to go down the road with integrity and say,
Yeah.
I'm doing this to the best of my ability.
Well, and I try to say this publicly frequently, and that is the path of orthodoxy is very wide.
Yeah, true.
To think that the path of orthodoxy is super narrow, you've already done yourself a disservice. You can be well within the orthodoxy, and it's still a very broad category. One of the elements in the book is respect, and I define that as believing that every person you meet from every walk of life, from every background and experience, has something to teach you. Because I think people do. It doesn't matter. I've talked to all kinds of people in my life. One of the saddest things to me about my job is I have a casual acquaintance with so many wonderful people that I don't have time to go deeper with because they're fascinating.
Yeah.
But I really believe that people have so much to offer us and so much to give us, and it does mature us. I don't know that it's dissonance necessarily, but it's certainly challenging. Sometimes it's dissonance, but sometimes it's just, I can't buy what you're saying, and here's why. And then you go, oh, that's a really
compelling.
Good. I just grew up a little bit,
How lonely is ministry for you? I know you're surrounded by people. That's
Yeah.
a given. The drone shot is that we're always surrounded by people. But what about your personal experience?
I mentioned Henry Nouwen earlier. He talks about moving from loneliness to solitude. I started ministry as an extrovert. The more people, the better. Just keep me. I'll go to the next thing, the next thing, and the next thing. I get energy from being with people. I've evolved now. I think I'm an introvert. I value solitude, and I think I value it over loneliness because I think it is lonely. I don't think there's any doubt that it is a lonely, and I don't know how it works in the synagogue, but in the church, you can be somebody's pastor for 20 years and say something in a sermon, and they don't even tell you, but they're gone.
Yeah.
They don't even have the decency to say, what did you mean by that? Or they've just decided what it was. And sometimes, you're like, what could have happened? And so I think when you go through a few of those experiences, you become more guarded. Mm-hmm. And as you become more guarded, you become more lonely. You do carry a lot of people's secrets. You're trying to navigate, and you have to have integrity in that. So, that's a weird because you're in a community and everybody kind of knows each other at some level. And so I do think it's lonely. I think it's a lonely life.
How do you balance that?
Well, I think family's safe. I mean, we have a big family, so 4 kids and 4 grandkids, and so there's a chaotic piece of all of that. An extended family.
PEA or PIE?
PIE. Yeah, there's no PEA at all. But I think you compensate that. And there are. I am in a group nationally, and we get together once a year that are other pastors in similar sized churches, a peer-to-peer learning experience, and that is a resource. I mean, that is a place I could pick up my phone right now and text, and all 40 of those people would be available to me to say, yes, we're praying for you, or here's what we did, or we dealt with that before. So there is some peer-to-peer, but it is a lonely experience, I think, in many ways.
Oh, I read a book called The Rabbi as Symbolic Exemplar, and it's a great book written by a rabbi. And one of the things he said in, early pages was, "This is lonely." And at the time I thought, lonely?
Yeah.
How can this be lonely?
Yeah.
This is so infused with people and meaning and conversation and encounter. And maybe like you, as I have grown in this, I realized, but there is something different about direct friendship that you don't want to find in this, or you don't find in this. And that's not necessarily in service to the person in front of you.
Yeah.
In some ways, they don't need you to be their friend. They have their friend.
Right.
They need you to hear them and support them.
Yeah.
Which I think is a little different, an aspect of friendship, but not friendship.
Yeah. And I also think there's an evolutionary process in that, and that is people are not as interpersonal as they used to be. I mean, that's not just, post-COVID, although that tipped some things over.
Right.
But, I grew up going to church, and we got up in the morning and went to church, and we rarely were not at lunch with somebody after church, and then we went back to church at night.
Yeah.
And then rarely did we go home without going to Denny's or someplace and hanging out, or going to someone's house, or people came to dinner, we went to dinner at people's houses. We just don't. I mean, we hardly even. We went out to dinner last night, and we looked around the restaurant, and we're like, man, it's been weeks. We pick things up, we run here, we run there. There were 12 people in the restaurant.
Yeah.
I was worried, are we going to get in because we didn't make a reservation? No, there's 12 people there.
Things are changing.
They've changed a lot.
Yeah, I agree. I agree there. I could tell you, don't need to bother, but examples from my own life in service here to this community, how many things have changed incrementally.
Yeah.
In the same way, one of the things that it just sticks out for me is, it used to be that thank you cards were just a constant. I don't mean to me. I mean, your kid gets a gift, whatever it was, that was part of the relationship. Now, some people would say, what a waste of time, right? Yeah. And we don't need to support paper that way or use paper that way. But something changed, and it didn't suddenly change because somebody said on TV, don't do it. We all got it somehow.
Yeah.
We all kind of got that there's a new normal. And that change in many ways, I think that's symbolic of what you're saying. Maybe it's an erosion, maybe it's an evolution of how we interact and how much time we're willing to actually look each other in the eyes, break bread together.
Yeah. Well, and I think, I don't want to get too philosophical, but I think, we have screens, and it's so easy to go home and immerse yourself in thoughtlessness and in just, entertainment for distraction. And I think, it actually takes energy. There is the idea of entropy. We just stop moving and we start to deteriorate at some level, and whether that's just socially. But I do think there is a definite change. Even when we're together, we're not together.
Right.
Yeah. So, and I see it on a Sunday, when I'm talking, I just choose to believe that they're, in their Bible app on their phone.
Right.
They're not really
making notes.
Yeah. They're diligently listening, But I do tell people on Sunday, if all you get from this is a nap, then bless you. Because maybe what you most need is
Right.
just a good rest, so. Yeah.
I just want to thank you. Really, really, I've learned a lot from you.
Well, thank you.
Found a lot in common. Here you are, a Christian minister. I'm a rabbi. There's so much that we share.
Yeah.
And I hope this conversation in the podcast form inspires more of this, people to reach
so.
across the table and say, oh, let's find out what we can learn from each other and what we can enjoy.
You do know we consider ourselves to be a part of the Judeo-Christian tradition,
Yes.
not just the Christian
course.
tradition. The new stuff doesn't make any sense without
Right.
the original stuff.
Yeah, thank you for saying that.
Yeah.
So I'll just hold this book again and say that I haven't read it, but I've heard the conversations contained in it, but I will read it. So it's just on the back, just to point out, you ask these questions, or your publisher asks this question: do you struggle to communicate? We've talked about that. Learn how to hold genuine conversations again. So I'm sure it's a good read, because you're always a pleasure to listen to.
Thank
and
you.
when I've heard you, I've always gone away thinking better thoughts about how I might do something, experience something in my life. So I'm grateful to you.
I appreciate that. Thanks for having me, and I appreciate it very much.
Pleasure. Thank you.
Thanks.
Our producer and editor is Jonah Lee Paz. Our musical theme is composed by Amotz Plessner, and our logo, graphic design by Janice Rudnunski. Find us wherever you find your podcasts.